Your Grace Bishop Emilianos, Your Grace Bishop Elpidios, Reverend Fathers, the Honourable Consul General for Greece, Mr. Christos Karas, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the second part of tonight's event. My name is Georgia Giorgio and I am a representative from SOFIA Orthodox Student Association. Before we begin, I would like to invite His Grace Bishop Elpidios to lead us with prayer.
Όλοι μαζί. Πάτερ ημών, ο εν της ουρανής, αγιαστήτω το όνομά σου, θέετο η βασιλεία σου, γεννηθήτω το θέλημά σου, ως εν ουρανό και επί της γης, των άρτων ημών των επιούσεων, δώσει μην σήμερον, και άφηση μην τα ωφελήματα ημών, ως και εμείς αφήνουμε τους ωφελέτες ημών, και εμείς ενέγγιση ημάς εις περασμών, αλλά ρίσε ημάς από το πονηρού. Come, O worshippers of the Trinity in heaven, let us praise the Trinity on earth, namely that of the Holy Hierarchs, Gregory, who is called the Theologian, Basil, whose name means kingdom, and John, rightly named after grace. They are the seas of the wisdom, the ocean currents of the Spirit, the ever-flowing springs that pour forth living water, the shining pearls, the stars on earth, the pilots of the church, the trees bearing bright fruit, the stewards of grace, the mouth of our Christ, and champions of the Trinity, by which they are directly illumined, and they unceasingly pray on behalf of our souls. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Grace. I would now like to invite His Grace Bishop Emilianos to welcome everyone formally on behalf of His Eminence Archbishop Makarios.
Θεοφιλέστατε, κύριε Γενικέ, αγαπητοί πατέρες, αγαπητοί μαθητές και διδάσκαλοι της θεολογικής μας σχολής και όλοι όσοι είστε εδώ σήμερα. Να σας μεταφέρω τις ευχές του Σεβασμιωτάτου Ποιμενάρχου μας και τα συγχαρητήρια στους διοργανωτές της εκδηλώσεως της σημερινής και εύχομαι οι τρεις ιεράρχες, τους οποίους τιμά η Εκκλησία μας σήμερα και κάναμε τον Ισπερινό τους και αύριο είναι η εορτή τους, να μας βοηθήσουν όλους μας να γνωρίσουμε κατά κάποιο τρόπο τον Τριαδικό Θεό, τον οποίο ήδη δόξασαν με τη ζωή τους και με τη διδασκαλία τους. Τώρα, Γεωργία, να συνεχίσουμε το πρόγραμμα και εύχομαι όλοι μας να αποκομίσουμε κάτι από τη σημερινή ομιλία και από το πάνελ. Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you, Your Grace. Tonight with our speakers, we will explore the theme of theology and revolution. To begin, Dr. Dimitri Kepreotes will be speaking to us on the spiritual underpinnings of the 1821 revolution, a tribute to the Three Hierarchs. Following this, we will have a roundtable discussion on tonight's theme, chaired by Professor Vrasidas Karalis, with panellists Dr. Vasilis Adrahtas, Dr. Mario Baghos, Dr. Dimitri Kepreotes, and the Very Revd Father Gerasimos Koutsouras. Each speaker will speak on the Three Hierarchs and the Greek Revolution from their own perspectives, but for the most part, the floor will be open to questions. We're excited to hear our speakers tonight and are very thankful to them for taking the time to present to us. Firstly, we will hear from Dr. Dimitri Kepreotes. Dr. Kepreotes is a graduate of the University of New South Wales and St. Andrew's Greek Orthodox Theological College, and has served in our Archdiocese and St. Andrew's Theological College in various positions between 1992 and 2015. His PhD was on the continuity of Greek education from Plato to modern times. He is currently engaged in projects that aim to share Greek tradition and our Christian Orthodox faith with the widest possible audience. I would now like to invite Dr. Kepreotes to present to us.
Thank you, Georgia. Your Graces, Consul General, Reverend Fathers, faculty members of St Andrew's Greek Orthodox Theological College, members of the SOFIA Orthodox Student University Association, dear executive of the Australian Hellenic Educators Association, dear friends, brothers and sisters. Thank you first of all for the honour of inviting me to speak this evening on a topic that is very dear to my heart. If I sound a little bit excited during the course of the next 25 minutes, you'll forgive me. The older I get, the more emotional I become. And this is just a fact of life. It is a topic close to my heart because we're going to speak about the 1821 revolution and the effect that that has on me as an individual, and I think on all of us as faithful Orthodox Christians in the 21st century. I thank the organisers, and I've discussed with the organisers how we've divided this evening's talk between what His Grace Bishop Elpidios told us in church about the Three Hierarchs, and myself concentrating almost exclusively on the revolution, and then bringing the strands together in the panel discussion, and we look forward to your comments very, very much. The historical context of the 1821 uprising is very simple, I'm sure, for an audience such as this. Before Ottoman rule, there was Byzantium. There were two pillars of Byzantine society, the state and the church. With the siege by the Ottomans and the fall of Constantinople in 1453, one of those pillars fell with it. The church remained standing, the lonely remnant of the 1,000-year empire. It continued in its role of sanctifying all aspects of daily life, while also safeguarding Christianity and its identity. It was a role that it took upon itself, but which was also thrust upon it. The Patriarch of Constantinople was made, by order of the Sultan, the head of the Rumiyet, that is to say, the nation of the Orthodox Christian population within the Ottoman Empire. Even the vestments of the bishop came to reflect something of the lost emperor's regalia. So these are the two historical bookends of the Ottoman Empire, which we will discuss this evening. One was obviously 1453, and the other end, the bookend, 1821. Of course, the reality is not as neat as these days' dates suggest. The city of Thessaloniki, for example, was only liberated as late as 1912. And I've already got a dry throat. The intention here is to consider certain empirical data removed as far as possible from historical debates that are likely to be extensions of the biases of their authors, whether positive or negative. In other words, we wish to look at what the people involved in the struggle said about the events and, importantly, about their own motivations. And they said many things, not only in words, but also by their actions. The late historian Sarandos Kargakos stressed how fortunate researchers are today in having approximately 20 memoirs written by those who were at the very centre of the events they described. I encourage you to find some of these primary sources and to read them for yourselves. We have, for example, the memoirs of Theodor Locotrones, the most renowned general of the War of Independence and a masterful tactician. His aide, called Theotokos, also provided his own account. And Theotokos writes, "Once the Byzantine Empire was lost, the clergy accepted the guardianship of an unprotected nation that possessed no other support or consolation." However, before getting ahead of ourselves, the one big question we wish to address is, what caused the Greek War of Independence? What motivated it? We use the terms War of Independence and Greek Revolution interchangeably tonight. The explosive outcome was obvious, the gunpowder, but its detonator, its trigger, much less so. Although no single cause could possibly be claimed for such a complex series of events between 1821 and 1829, there is an argument to be made that the preeminent cause was the spiritual motivation provided by the Orthodox Christian faith. Of course, there is no intention here to idealize the faith that people held at that time. Certainly, some would have been indifferent to the faith of their ancestors, as in any place and any time. There were also those who turned their backs on revolutionary efforts, people who did not know what liberty looked like after 14 generations of its deprivation, and who, as a consequence, shunned the prospect of change. The assertion here is instead that at least for those who were sufficiently motivated to fight for change, religious faith played a major part, if not the major part. Those who fought believed more in the value of orthodoxy and less in the secular slogans of the European Enlightenment concerning brotherhood, liberty, and equality. If the historical documents are to be taken on their own merit, none of the military leaders of the Greek War of Independence were concerned about what Montesquieu or other Enlightenment thinkers had written. Almost none of the fighters would have heard of such ideas, much less read them in books. In the impossible event that they had access to such works, the average persons that we are speaking about could not read anyway. References to the world-changing events that took place in France in 1789 were no doubt made, and with admiration, by certain prominent personalities of the period, like the great Rigas. Yet it needs to be remembered that the niceties of these acknowledgements do not equate to a core reason for going to war in a completely different context. Because our topic tonight relates to those who actually fought, not to the ideologues or the theorists, even if they were all on the same side ethnically or culturally. The Christians under Ottoman rule had more pressing matters to deal with. They were educationally diminished. They were physically restricted to live in poorer areas. They were more heavily taxed than their Muslim neighbours, and I could go on. The Christians were restricted even architecturally. Indeed, one would be hard-pressed to find a single church larger than a stable in Greece today, unless it had been built before Ottoman rule or after it in the liberated period of the last 200 years. Respect enjoyed as a people of the book, which is what Christians were, was punctuated by forced Islamification from time to time. Generalizations about freedoms of religion do not suffice. True, there were certain freedoms, but a general rule cannot be made out of them. This evening, we celebrate three men who knew very well about social injustice. If the three hierarchs offered the people education, cultivation, shelter, nourishment, love, hope, and the word of truth 1,500 years earlier, well, these goods were all lacking in the lead up to 1821. The three hierarchs knew how to stand up to the most powerful authorities of their day. Let's take the example of St. Basil the Great, first of all. The emperor, when St. Basil was alive, named Valens, was an adherent of the Arian heresy. He sent his prefect Modestus to Basil to force him into religious conformity. Modestus began, immodestly, to threaten the saint with the confiscation of his property. "We will take all your possessions," he said. St. Basil answered calmly, "But I have only a few books and this old cassock." "Then we will exile you." "Basil, any place you send me belongs to God anyway. No problem." "That's enough," said Modestus. "We will torture you." Basil replied, "My body is so weak that I would die with the first blow, and this would be doing a favour for me, as it will bring me all the sooner to God, for whom I live and labour." Basil's fearless response prompted Modestus to protest that no one had ever spoken to him in that manner before. Basil replied, "Perhaps you have never had to deal with a bishop before." And then there's Gregory, the theologian, who also stood up to authority. St. Gregory said in his second oration, in verse 82, "It is better to have a commendable war than a peace which severs a person from God." Although, to be fair, I believe he was talking more about spiritual warfare. Gregory, like Basil, was from Cappadocia, but he was called to Constantinople to help combat the Arian heresy, which was at that time rife in the city. It had in fact become the majority faith over the Orthodox numerically. St. Gregory commenced theological lectures from a home that was transformed into a church called Anastasia. Gradually he managed, single-handedly we might say, to restore the correct faith among the people. Well, during one of these gatherings, before he became Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, in the home church called Anastasia, in the year 379, the heretics burst in violently, killing one of the Orthodox bishops and injuring Gregory himself. The theologian and poet, who loved silence and contemplation among nature, was living proof that caring for souls is not a casual matter. Then finally we come to St. John, the golden-mouthed Chrysostom, who was famously known for challenging the greed he saw around him when he became Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople as well. Greed of all kinds, in all places, no matter how high up. This ended in Empress Evdoxia having hatred towards him, convinced that she was the target of his sermons. When push came to shove and she expressed her antipathy, Chrysostom proclaimed, "Again Herodias demands the head of John on a platter." As we all know, the golden-mouthed John was forced to march enormous distances in Asia Minor, his exile in such harsh conditions being a disguised form of execution. His last words were, "Glory to God for all things. Δόξα τω Θεώ πάντων ένικεν." The hierarchs did not have to take up weapons. We can only speculate about what they would have done had they lived in another era. What we do know, however, is that they were all prepared to suffer in their own bodies for what they believed in. This is the mark of a true shepherd. This is a mark of a true Christian. This is what they share ultimately with their spiritual children of 1821 and throughout the centuries. But we return to our narrative about the revolution, although the comments about the three hierarchs are not a digression. The revolution was everywhere proclaimed in a religious manner, whether via the ceremonial elevation of the cross or through taking an oath or by raising the banner of the revolution during a doxology. At the monastery of AHEA Lavra, the banner chosen, το λάβαρο της Επαναστάσεως, was in fact the deep reddish veil of the royal doors, the material that we put on the royal doors, depicting the Dormition of the Mother of God. No matter the region, the religion was the same. There were many regional flags that represented local forces. The one thing they shared was the symbol of the Holy Cross. It was the revolutionary symbol that, with gradual variations of colours and other things, would eventually adorn the official flag of the independent nation. Now, most of us know when the revolution commenced, but when did it end? We think of the revolution commencing in March of that year, but there was an earlier diversion tactic outside of Greek territory in the areas of modern-day Romania. To make a long story short, the struggle commenced with Alexander Ypsilantis in February 1821, and it ended with his brother Dimitri Ypsilantis in September 1829. Alexander formed and led the first military force of the struggle, called the Sacred Battalion. The flag of this battalion displayed the words that Constantine the Great saw in the sky, en tuto nika, in this sign, be victorious, together with the iconographic portrayals of himself and his mother St. Helen. The oath that the Sacred Battalion took equates to a creed in itself, And it says, among other things, "As an Orthodox Christian and son of the Church, I swear in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Trinity to be loyal to my homeland and my religion. I swear to bleed until death for my religion and my country." Ypsilantis published a proclamation of the struggle. Its title summarized the twofold aim of the call to arms. It stated, "Fight for the faith and the homeland. Machou hyper pistos και πατρίδος." The coupling of these ideals of faith and country in that order of priority would be broadly adopted, therefore and thereafter, together with the battle cry, "Freedom or death." When the city of Kalamata was successfully taken very early on in the revolution, the first church service was celebrated in thanksgiving. George Finlay, a Scottish historian who took part in the revolution, wrote his own history of what he saw. He states, 24 priests officiated and 5,000 armed men stood around. Never was the service of thanksgiving celebrated with greater fervour, nor with warmer gratitude to their church and their God. Patriotic tears poured down the cheeks of rude warriors. You can find the entire book on the internet that George Finlay wrote, with the title, simply, History of the Greek Revolution, and it was published in 1861. Why tears down the cheeks of fighters? This was written by a cultivated European eyewitness, not a melodramatic black and white Greek movie script of the 1950s. The answer lies in appreciating what preceded the revolution for 400 years. And a large part of that has to do with what we're about to cover right now. Throughout the 4 centuries of Ottoman rule, martyrdom figured prominently. Although the church was granted a degree of freedom of worship within a Muslim environment, situations arose in which Christians were forced individually to deny their faith or else be put to death. These men, women, and children became known as the new martyrs. In fact, tomorrow we celebrate the holy new martyr Theodor from Mytilene, who in the year 1784 was executed by hanging. It would have been so easy and tempting to abandon Christianity back then. Think about it. With the recitation of a couple of phrases of the Shahada, one crossed sides completely from ruled to rulers. In the eyes of those who purposefully remained Christian, however, who were also the overwhelming majority through some 14 generations, the significance of religious conviction reigned supreme. It is humbling to read the accounts of personal sacrifice by ordinary Orthodox villagers, ordinary people. One may consider, for example, the testimony relating to the new martyr Demetrius, who died in 1808, as it comes from not his fellow countryman, this account, but from a French official, Francois Pouqueville, who witnessed the events. Pouqueville was Napoleon Bonaparte's consul at the court of Ali Pasha of Ioannina, and throughout 2 decades, immediately prior to the outbreak of the revolution, he saw and described the degree of Ottoman oppression in many parts of Greece. The Frenchman provided a valuable account of the interrogation that preceded Demetrius' martyrdom, not as a fanciful literary device, but as a testimony to the young man's unwavering faith. The clergy as combatants and the fighters as faithful. The Orthodox Church never developed a theology of a just war, much less of a holy war. Armed conflict necessarily entails injustices. A defensive war can only be the lesser evil. But the Church has not stopped praying officially in its litanies for the Christ-loving army, υπέρ του φιλοχρίστου στρατού, to this day. We pray for the army in the divine liturgies ascribed to St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great. War implies not only a willingness to inflict suffering, but also to suffer affliction for the sake of a greater principle, such as the inherent right of personal freedom. As just mentioned, there is also the essence of what the three hierarchs stood for: to stand one's ground for the sake of one's convictions. If God grants free will to each of us, who are you to take it away from me, or me from you? In this vein, one contemporary historian of the events, Spyridon Trikoupis, who became the first Prime Minister of Greece in 1833, wrote concerning, quote, the truly holy clergy, unquote, who would choose torments and death in preference to the enjoyment of worldly goods. Of all the patriarchs of Constantinople enthroned following the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, only 13 had a natural death. All others died either by drowning, hanging, or the sword, if they did not leave their last breath in jail or in exile. Out of a total of 200 bishops throughout the Ottoman territory at the time of the revolution, 73 took part actively in the struggle, 42 suffered persecution and torture, while 45 were put to death or fell on the battlefield. The ecumenical patriarch Gregory V was one of those who met a violent death. Stratford Canning, who was a cousin of the British Prime Minister George Canning, was another witness, and he describes the execution of ecumenical patriarch Gregory V as follows. At 5 o'clock in the evening of Easter Sunday, April 1821, the good and venerable patriarch was seized on his departure from the church and hanged at the gate in the presence of an immense multitude. 3 more Greek bishops, he said, were executed at the same time and in the same manner, but in different quarters of Constantinople. No matter how the reasons for the execution may be evaluated, the facts concerning the person, place, and timing are striking. This was the execution of the most senior clergyman of the Orthodox Church. It took place on the grounds of the Patriarchate and in the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and it occurred within a fortnight of the outbreak of the Uprising in Greece. How can the depth of feeling and fear experienced by Christians, as 4 of their spiritual shepherds dangled dead in various parts of one city, possibly be quantified or articulated? The execution of bishops verified the words of the Bible. Strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. It had historical precedents as well. In 1610, Bishop Dionysios of Larissa, called the philosopher or Skilosophos by his enemies, led a rebellion which was crushed in utter defeat. He was skinned and his remains filled with hay, only to be sent to Constantinople together with the heads of 85 rebels. There were approximately 70 local revolutions over the 400 years of the occupation. We might call 1821 the final revolution. Amongst the first to give his life in this final revolution, on April 24, 1821, was a young clergyman known in history as Athanasios Diakos, the deacon. He was captured but refused to be set free on condition of denying his faith. So he was impaled like a paschal lamb and placed over a fire. He was aged 33. General Makrianis would later write in his memoirs, "At the place where you died, Leonidas, with your 300, there they also died for faith and the homeland." Without an understanding of the desperation reached at that time, the mobilization by clergy, monks and nuns in the liberation efforts could well be regarded as a scandal. Monasteries, places of prayer above all else, came to serve as bastions of the War of Independence. In a law voted by the temporary government on April 8th, 1822, gold and silver items of the monasteries and churches were to be made into coins for the treasury. The treasury didn't exist, but anyway, went into a treasury so as to meet the needs of the war. Remember, it's a 9-year war. However, in speaking about the spiritual underpinning of the revolution, we are not referring to the clergy alone, but also to the faith of the lay people. Most of us have heard of the great shrine on the island of Tinos that attracts tens of thousands of pilgrims every year, at least before COVID. Well, the sacred icon of the Annunciation of the Theotokos was found during the Revolution, in the year 1823, following dreams that came to the devout nun Pelagia. And many leaders of the Revolution, lay people, not necessarily priests, made a special pilgrimage to pay respects and gain strength during the Revolution. Oh, did I mention that the date on which the holy icon was found in 1823 was January 30, the feast of the Three Hierarchs. Homeland and religion are everything. For these we took up arms, wrote the extraordinary General Makrianis. It was he who said that most monks gave their lives in the Revolution. And we cannot escape mentioning Locotrones once more. He describes how he entered a small church in the town of Chrysovitsi in the Peloponnese, and there, quote, cried for Hellas and prayed, "My all-holy Mother of God, help to instill courage in the Greeks once again." Precisely when the outcome of the revolution did not appear to be promising at all, he not only offered prayer, but also narrated how he received an answer to his prayer. Although nothing in his immediate environment would have justified optimism logically, he exclaimed after leaving the church, God bless you, Father, thank you very much. God has put his signature to our freedom, and he is not taking it back. Famous words. Later on, the English Captain Hamilton approached Locotrones, as we read in the Memoirs of the latter. What is going on with me today? And says Locotrones, once, after we had taken Nafplion, Hamilton came to me. He told me that the Greeks should seek appeasement, whereupon England would act as an intermediary. I replied, this could never happen. Freedom or death. Captain Hamilton, I said, we never made appeasement with the Turks. Our king was killed. He made no treaty. And just a few words of conclusion. The uprising of the Greeks did not take place on the ruins of a disintegrating Ottoman Empire. Had that been the case, it would have been much easier for us to interpret. Although signs of decline had appeared, the Ottoman Empire lasted for another 100 years, precisely, officially ending in 1922, when the title of Sultan ceased. The Greek Revolution is, for this reason also, difficult to categorize in history. It began against all odds and finished beyond all reasonable expectation. It was not like other insurrections in which one sector of society must rise against the other. It was instead one faith group rebelling against an empire. It was Christians overthrowing Muslim overlords, no matter how much one may wish to make smooth the rough edges of such a statement. Christians fought not because the others were Muslim, but because they wished to remain Christian. The national character of the uprising does not efface its spiritual underpinning. This is because religious identity defined the national identity. And this connection is not a matter of conjecture. It was expressed verbatim by the delegates to the national assemblies. Indeed, the first National Assembly in 1822 provided an incisive summary in such a sentence as this, which cut right to the bone of the matter. It declared formally that the people, quote, took up weapons and sought nothing through them except the glory and splendour of the Church of Christ, which is persecuted and despised together with her clergy. Whereas modern revolutionary movements often had the churches in their firing line, the Greek Revolution intrinsically involved the clergy, not as a target to be removed, but as a fellow struggler to be joined on the front line of the effort. In 1832, with the revolution now over, the Minister for Ecclesiastical Matters, Iakovos Rizos, reflected, and I quote, I drink and I quote, "How many times the Greek clergy displayed heroic Christianity, How many times the venerable shepherds disregarded their own lives and laid them down for the sake of their flock. In 1837, the University of Athens was established. Having just 4 schools to begin with, it is indicative that one of the 4 would be dedicated to theology. Only several years afterwards, in 1841, the same university was looking for an annual day on which to celebrate the value of education. The feast of the Three Hierarchs, January 30, on the liturgical calendar, was chosen for this precise purpose, and the tradition soon spread widely. It is also interesting that in the year 1838, Locotrones, who was alive, personally addressed a class of school students on Pnika Hill, right opposite the Acropolis Hill in Athens, on the location where Athenian democracy was born and exercised. The teeming symbolism of the place and the person who was speaking to the first generation of free children needs no elaboration. General Locotrones entreated them, quote, "You must keep your faith and reinforce it, because when we took up arms, first we said for the faith and then for the homeland." Unquote. Freedom or death. The slogan of the struggle signified a transcendence of the fear of physical death for the sake of the inherent human value of self-determination. When the struggle began, the overwhelming likelihood was that it would end in death, not freedom. It's easy for us to look back in hindsight and just see the freedom part. 200 years later, we are tied to the fundamental declarations, defiance and prayerful pleas of the protagonists, unable to escape the spiritual overtones of each of them. What else then could validate this revolution as an essentially faith-driven oddity of world history, other than that its outcome was a miracle? Thank you. You see a little, I thank Father Irineos and Tassos for inserting at the last minute this 2-minute video, which will just give a visual impression of some of the people that we've spoken about already.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kepreotes, for that edifying exploration of the Greek Revolution that so eloquently tied in the relevance of the Three Hierarchs. We will now have a roundtable discussion on the theme of theology and revolution. This will be led by Professor Vrasidas Karalis. Professor Karalis holds the chair of St. Nicholas Laurantus in modern Greek and Byzantine studies at the University of Sydney. He has translated Patrick Vespers and the Vivisector. He is the editor of Modern Greek Studies. His main publications in English include A History of Greek Cinema, Realism in Greek Cinema, Recollections of Mr. Manoli Laskaris, and The Demons of Athens, Reflections on Presence. He has also edited the collections Cornelius Castoriadis and the Project of Radical Democracy, Martin Heidegger and the Aesthetics of Being, and Power, Justice, and Judgment in Hannah Arendt. He is currently working on the first complete translation of St. John of Damascus's dogmatic treatise, The Exact Exposition of Orthodox Faith, the intellectual biography of George Yamistobletho, and the critical edition of Patriarch Cyril Lucaris's controversial confession. Our panellists are Dr. Vasilis Adrahtas, Dr. Mario Baghos, Dr. Dimitri Kepreotes, and the Very Revd Father Gerasimos Koutsouras. I will briefly introduce our panellists before handing over to Dr. Karalis. Dr. Vasilis Adrahtas was born in Baghos in 1968 but grew up in Athens, where he also received most of his education. He holds a PhD in sociology from the Pantheon University and a PhD in studies of religion from the University of Sydney. However, his first and greatest love has always been theology. His work experience includes teaching, translation, editing, publishing, print, media, radio production, and academic research, but he has spent most of his time as a lecturer. He has taught at St. Andrew's Theological College, the University of Sydney, the National University of Athens, the Hellenic Open University in Patras, Macquarie University, Western Sydney University, UNSW, and Charles Sturt University. His specialisation is in early Christianity, patristic studies, Byzantine philosophy, Islamic studies, and Indigenous Australian religions. He has published a substantial number of articles in academic journals, numerous chapters in collective volumes, and he has authored and/or edited more than 10 books. His most recent publication is Islam, Civility and Political Culture. Dr. Mario Baghos is the lecturer in patristics and church history at St. Andrew's Greek Orthodox Theological College and Chief Publishing Officer of St. Andrew's Orthodox Press. He has taught at various tertiary institutions in the areas of patristics, church history, world religions, and biblical studies. He has also published extensively on the topics of patristic eschatology, the lives of Orthodox Christian saints, and Byzantine art and architecture. Father Gerasimos is an historian and is the parish priest at the Greek Orthodox Church and Community of St. George in Rose Bay. Father Gerasimos holds a Master of Theology and a Diploma of Byzantine Music from the University of Thessalonica, as well as a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts from the University of Sydney. He was trained in Byzantine ecclesiastical music by the late Dimitrios Kepreotes, archon music teacher of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and was protopsaltis of the Church of St. Theodor in Thessalonica. Upon his return to Australia, Father taught at All Saints Grammar, Belmore, before being ordained to the diaconate and priesthood in 2007. He is also a former lecturer in church history at St. Andrew's Greek Orthodox Theological College, where he taught for 16 years. Father Gerasimos specialises in the late Byzantine and modern history of our church and has presented on various subjects in this field at different tertiary institutions, parishes and youth fellowships. He is also currently the Orthodox chaplain at the University of Sydney. I would now like to invite Professor Karalis to lead the discussion and our panellists, Dr Adrahtas, Baghos, Kepreotes and Father Gerasimos to take a seat at the front of the table.
Εγώ φαντάζομαι κάθομαι εδώ τώρα, έτσι, κάθομαι όρθιος. Να πω λίγα πράγματα στα ελληνικά νομίζω, γιατί μιλήσαμε πολύ στα αγγλικά και νομίζω καλό θα είναι να μιλήσουμε και λίγο στα ελληνικά. τη γλώσσα. Να ευχαριστήσω, Θεοφιλέστε, ευχαριστούμε πολύ για την πρόσκληση να είμαστε εδώ. Για μας είναι μεγάλη τιμή. Εξοχότατε, αυτός είναι ο τίτλος, εξοχότατος δεν είναι? Ναι, πώς είναι? Εντιμότατος. Ποιος είναι εξοχότατος? Δεν προσπαθώ να καταλάβω πάντα. Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω πριν από όλα τον Βασίλη τον Αδραχτά που οργάνωσε αυτή τη συνάντηση και την Αρχιεπισκοπή που μας έφερε όλους μαζί για ένα τόσο πολύ σημαντικό θέμα όπως είναι η Επανάσταση του 21 και τις σχέσεις με την Εκκλησία. Ο Δημήτρης προηγουμένως, με τον Δημήτρη, πώς να συναγωνιστούμε τα αγγλικά σου μετά, θα φέρει φοβερό εδώ πέρα. Εσύ είσαι αυτή τη suavity που λένε, έτσι, the suavity που have, you know, just very enchanting. Αυτό που ήθελα να πω είναι ότι ουσιαστικά μετά το πρόβλημα που έχουμε με την ελληνική επανάσταση, όπως θα δείτε, και ειδικά μερικοί από εσάς που διαβάζετε τα ελληνικά αυτήν την εποχή στην Ελλάδα, βλέπετε ότι αυτή τη στιγμή υπάρχει μια πολύ μεγάλη σύγκρουση, όχι μόνο για τη σχέση της Εκκλησίας με την Επανάσταση, αλλά τη σχέση της Ελλάδας με την Επανάσταση, των Ελλήνων με την Επανάσταση. Υπάρχει ένα μεγάλο κύμα των λεγόμενων κίνημα, των λεγόμενων έθνο-μηδενιστών, όπως το ονομάζουμε, οι οποίοι πιστεύουν ότι δεν υπήρχε καμία σχέση ανάμεσα. Η Επανάσταση ήταν ένα πολιτικό γεγονός. Κάποιοι άλλοι πιστεύουν ότι δεν υπήρχε καν Επανάσταση και δεν υπήρχε καμία αίσθηση της συνέχειας μεταξύ της τουρκοκρατίας. Δεν υπήρχε καν τουρκοκρατία, μάλιστα με πολύ έξυπνο τρόπο ονομάζεται Οθωμανική περίοδος τώρα, όχι τουρκοκρατία. Και στο τέλος έχουμε βέβαια τους εθνολάτρες, ας πούμε έτσι, και τέλος έχουμε ένας καινούριος όρος, τον οποίο σας συνιστώ να γράψετε κάτω, ουδετεροπατρία, έτσι που προέκυψε πρόσφατα, ουδετεροπατρία, η οποία μας δείχνει, που σημαίνει πάρα πολλά πράγματα, τα οποία δεν μπορώ να αναλύσω εδώ. Αλλά αυτό που ήθελα να πω, γιατί και να τελειώσω με τη δική μου σχέση και να συντονίσω μετά τη συζήτηση. Ποια είναι η σχέση της Επανάστασης με τους τρεις ιεράρχες και αργότερα, νομίζω, με αυτό που βγήκε από την Ελληνική Επανάσταση. Για μένα είναι πολύ σημαντικό να καταλάβουμε τη θέση των τριών ιεραρχών, τον 4ο αιώνα, κατά τη μετάβαση από την κλασική εποχή στη Βυζαντινή εποχή. Η επίδρασή τους, their contribution, if I may say, was so crucial that we cannot understand the new Christian paradigm that became dominant during the Middle Ages and it's dominant to this day. Οι Καπαδόκες πατέρες έφεραν μαζί όλη αυτή την σύνθεση του χριστιανισμού και της αρχαίας Ελλάδας. Υπάρχει μια πολύ ωραία έκφραση που διάβασα πρόσφατα περάσαμε από την... Οι αρχαίοι Έλληνες είχαν ένα ιδανικό, όπως λέγανε, καλοκαγαθία, να είσαι καλός και αγαθός. Οι χριστιανοί έφεραν την έννοια της φιλοκαλίας και της θεογνωσίας σε ένα τεράστιο, σε ένα μείγμα που έγινε μέσα σε αυτή την περίπτωση αυτόν τον 4ο αιώνα, και περάσαμε σε αυτή τη σύνθεση που δημιούργησε το χριστιανικό πολιτισμό, που despite what we think, it's still Christian to this day, even if we live in a post-Christian society. Τι σημαίνει post-Christianity θα μας τα πει ο Βασίλης βέβαια εδώ πέρα σε αυτό το θέμα, και νομίζω επίσης να το συνδέσω με την Επανάσταση. It's very interesting, and it's something that Dimitri related to, that when the Epanastasis broke out, immediately during the first Constitutional Assembly, one of the main clauses was to revive, as they said, την νομοθεσία των Γρεκών αυτοκρατόρων του Βυζαντίου. Είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρον ότι η λέξη που ονομάζουν είναι Γρεκός, έτσι, εκείνη την εποχή. Εδώ έχουμε το ελληνικό έθιμο, επίσης είναι, αν οι Έλληνες είναι, the Greeks have three names for themselves, as you remember, is Ρωμιοί, Γρεκοί, and Έλληνες. And you will tell us what each one of these you are, of course, at the end of this discussion. Γιατί όπως είπε ο Αθανάσιος Διάκος, εγώ Γρεκός γεννήθηκα, εγώ Γρεκός και θα πεθάνω. Δεν είπε εγώ γεννήθηκα Έλληνας. Θα μας πεις, Δημήτρη, γιατί, έτσι. So, what happened in the revolution in 1921 is, if you remember, it was a process, a long process. The problem, of course, as you remember, Gerasimos knows that very well, what was the first attempt to define a Greek through the constitution, through legally? And you remember the first article of the Constitution after the Holy Trinity is that όποιος πιστεύει στο Χριστόν είναι Έλληνας. Αυτό είναι το πρώτο άρθρο του πρώτου συντάγματος, του ελληνικού συντάγματος, που βγήκε από την Επίδαυρο. Then we have some qualifications. Ξέρω, Father Gerasimos does not believe in that, but you are multiculturalist, you believe in diversity, inclusion, and these kind of things. This is a very interesting attempt, as you understand, to sort of essentially define a political and a social identity on the basis of religion. And this is what I will take from Dimitri's talk, that every national identity has a religious underpinning. And that's my first question to our panel here. Vasili, what do you think about that? Μπορείς να το πεις και στα ελληνικά, έτσι, νομίζω.
Εμένα θα μου επιτρέψετε να χρησιμοποιήσω και τις δύο γλώσσες interchangeably, για να έχουμε έτσι μια ισορροπία. Αναφορικά με το ερώτημα, συμφωνώ πλήρως. Και λέω συμφωνώ παρόλο που θα το διατύπωνα με άλλους όρους, με άλλες λέξεις. Πίσω από κάθε εθνική national identity, εθνική συνείδηση, βρίσκεται ένα αίσθημα, a sense, ένα αίσθημα του ιερού, a sense of sacredness. Τώρα, εάν είναι θρησκευτικό με την έννοια που συνήθως χρησιμοποιούμε τη λέξη θρησκεία, religion, είναι μια κουβέντα μεγάλη. Αλλά πάντως υπάρχει μια αίσθηση ιερότητας πίσω από κάθε εθνική συνείδηση. Και είναι χαρακτηριστικό και νομίζω ότι ίσως the gist of Dimitri's talk was exactly this, that we have all these revolutions in Europe, and not only Europe, and more or less the church, the clergy, is the enemy against us. But in the case of the Greek Revolution, the clergy and the church are basically everywhere. Θα σας φέρω ένα παράδειγμα που προκάλεσε, το λέω γιατί συνέβη εδώ, δηλαδή στα καθημάς. Τόλμησα, γιατί έτσι το εξέλαβαν κάποιοι, τόλμησα να γράψω ένα άρθρο στο Νέο Κόσμο και να πω ότι αρκετά αυτό το ιδεολόγημα ότι η Ελληνική Επανάσταση και η Εκκλησία δεν έχουν καμία σχέση μεταξύ τους, και έγραψα ότι επιτέλους πρέπει να σταματήσει αυτό το πράγμα, και εάν αντιλαμβανόμαστε καλά τους όρους, θα πρέπει να λέμε ότι εάν κάποιος έκανε την Επανάσταση, την έκανε η Εκκλησία. Και όχι μόνο αυτό, αλλά ότι η Επανάσταση του 1821 είναι μια νέα εκκλησιαστική εμπειρία. Είναι η Εκκλησία ως Επανάσταση. Και βέβαια βγήκαν κάποιοι και είπαν ότι λέει ο άνθρωπος είναι τρελός. Και μάλλον πρόκειται περί τρέλας, έτσι, επαναστατικής τρέλας. Αλλά θα ήθελα αυτό λιγάκι να το στοχαστούμε, ότι στην ιστορία της Εκκλησίας, μάλλον το πω διαφορετικά, η ιστορία της Εκκλησίας είναι μια ιστορία, όπως έλεγε ο παλιός μας καθηγητής, το συγχωρεμένος τώρα ο Στυλιανός Παπαδόπουλος, είναι μια ιστορία αύξησης της αληθείας. Μια ιστορία στην οποία η Εκκλησία συνεχώς αυξάνει στην συνείδηση και στην κατανόηση του πνεύματος. Εμπλουτίζεται η εμπειρία της η πνευματική. Το 21 είναι ένας τέτοιος εμπλουτισμός. Μια καινούρια, a new ecclesial experience.
Thank you, Βασίλη.
Ναι, να κάνω ένα κλείσιμο και μετά μπορεί να μην ξαναμιλήσω.
Σύντομο.
Ναι, πολύ σύντομο.
Ναι.
Μπορεί να υπάρξει μια θεολογία της Επανάστασης, μια ορθόδοξη θεολογία της Επανάστασης? Όχι, δεν μπορεί να υπάρξει. Γιατί η ζωή δεν μπαίνει σε καλούπια. Όταν το απαιτούν οι περιστάσεις, κάνουμε Επανάσταση. Και κάνουμε ως χριστιανή Επανάσταση. Αλλά αυτό δεν μπαίνει σε καλούπια και γι' αυτό δεν μπορεί να υπάρξει μια θεολογία, ένα σύστημα, μια θεωρία της Επανάστασης.
Thank you, Vasily. That was very enlightening, and I think that the idea that it was an ecclesial revolution within the church is so true, as a matter of fact, right? You know, I think Dimitri didn't mention Papaflessa. You cannot understand the revolution without Papaflessa, because his passion and his lies at the same time, right? You know, he was sure that the Tsar of Russia will intervene on behalf of the Greeks, having no contact with the Tsar of Russia whatsoever. Αλλά έτσι γίνεται, όπως έλεγε ο Locotrones. Now, can I ask Father Gerasimos, what do you think about this? Is this, that connection between the church and, you have done a history of the 13th, 14th century, and you know that from the past, there was always, especially after the Fourth Crusade, the church had taken in the East almost not simply a nation-preserving role, but a nation-building role as well. And that happened because the Greek nationality, as we have it today, came out of this confrontation not with the Muslims, but with the Franks, with the Frangus. And that's a very important element of the whole thing, I would say. What do you think about that? Is this any connection between the 14th century and 1821?
Look, historically speaking, the question of identity is an evolving one. So it's very easy for us in our day to view the past with our own experiences and our own lenses. And the better historian or the better history is that which understands that period of time in their shoes, in their context.
Is it possible?
It's not always possible. And history is not a precise science. In fact, that's a question we'll cover later on. Is it a science in the first place? It's a field of study. But let's go back to your question. To what extent does the late Byzantine period take part or is a factor in the evolution of the modern Greek identity? Is that more like...
modern Greek political and ecclesial identity. Huh? Yeah.
So, look, I suppose we can start with the terminology of Ellinas coming back into the picture after a long period of absence. So, on the official level, we know that what we now call the Byzantine Empire was always known as the Roman Empire, and both the emperors of the time and the scholars and historians talking about themselves refer to themselves as Romei or Romii. The term Ellinas comes back in the 1200s and onwards. So that is one aspect we need to bring up to the question, that it starts coming back in and is not something that is rejected offhand. But nevertheless, there are people still calling themselves Romii up to living memory. Ellinas, in many respects, does not become officially the title until the revolution. That's one aspect of it. How do we self-identify? Now, in terms of your question of ecclesiological, what was the shift around that time? Yes, we do develop a sense of identity in opposition to the Franks or the Western Europeans generally, and Frankish or French is the label used for all the Western Europeans. But let's not forget that the Eastern Christians have been in conflict on and off with the Muslim world from the start, from the 600s. So that never stopped. There were some periods of peace, but it was a constant element of warfare with the Muslim Middle East. Let's jump to the 15th century. Now, ecclesiologically, I think the next big shift that we need to remind our audience or inform our audience about is how the church becomes the protector or takes on the leadership of the nation. And so the Millet Bashi, which is the Turkish term for the head of the nation, is translated into Genarchis or Ethnarchis as it later evolves. So the Patriarch of Constantinople is considered the head of the nation in the absence of an emperor, president, or any other form. I won't go into the detail, maybe that'll come up with the other panellists, but that's a big shift in how we view where we stand as a people. Now, the other thing I would like us to discuss tonight at some point is to what extent does Christian principle and Christian tenet harmonise with any violent revolution?
That was my question
so
for Mario.
We should cover that tonight because
that would also for Mario because he has studied that.
Yeah.
So give the microphone to Mario now.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Oh boy, the easy question. I've been reflecting on it and I don't know if my answer will be sufficient, but with God's help maybe I'll be able to come up with something. Thank you, Vrasidas.
You are young, you have to
Yeah.
dive deep.
The Son of God, our Lord Jesus Christ, defeated the only enemy that we have, which is death. And the one who has the power over death, which is the devil. This has to do with an internal warfare that we as Christians have to assimilate and participate in by being conformed to his will. And we discern this in the lives of the apostles and the martyrs throughout the generations who die self-sacrificially, loving their enemy. That's the fundamental axiom of the Christian faith. And these are, let's say, these figures who by the grace of Christ are able to say along with him, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." I don't know if I'll ever be able to say that, I confess to you. Like Saint Stephen and the saints throughout the generations are the heroes par excellence, and we are all called by the grace of God within the church to become like them. What we see in the earlier centuries of the Christian faith, because Christ was born behind enemy lines, in a fallen world conditioned by our passions, our attachments, selfish attachments to objects of our desire, which are exacerbated by demonic temptation. And in that world, the saints are called to him to assimilate to his love by giving up themselves. The martyrs, we spoke about them. And what we see in the literature immediately with St. Paul in Ephesians is a shifting of the emphasis away from external warfare, which was part and parcel of the world of that time, Greco-Roman civilization, the warrior cultures. A shifting of the emphasis away from external warfare to internal warfare. This we see in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, but our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and the principalities and the forces in the heavenly places, the demons. And he says, put on the armour of faith, therefore. Is it the shield of salvation, the sword of righteousness? I don't remember where these virtuous attributes to which symbolic weapon they go, but that's what St. Paul does. And that conditions the entire hagiographical tradition, along with athletic imagery, those who are crowned like the runners in a race. And even the notion of conquest, if you look at the book of Revelation, the ascended Christ, when he appears in glory to St. John, the theologian, he gives messages to the seven churches, and he says, to those who conquer I will give. What kind of conquest is Christ referring to? The ascetic conquest in love. Now, given what I've just reflected upon, it'll be obvious that there is some incompatibility between the Christian life and the life of external warfare against one's enemies. However, this is something that I've reflected on, and I don't know if I have it right, and perhaps my fellow panellists, their graces, can further clarify my thoughts on this, or you, Professor. But God, he allows, through his providence, the passions of peoples and the entire nations to be moved in certain directions. We discern this in the Old Testament, so that both the oppressor and the oppressed are taught a lesson to be brought back to him. This is everywhere in the Old Testament. Entire nations, peoples are moved, so that those who are receptive enough to the will of God to become lovingly self-sacrificial in the way that Christ is, can be brought back. And the most striking example that we have in our history, and it's paradoxical even for me to contend with this, is the fall of Constantinople, which, according to all of the contemporary testimonies we have from that period, was permitted by God because the Romans, or the Greeks, had joined with the Catholic Church in order to attain political support. Now, I say this with all respect to Constantine Palaiologos and his compatriots, who are heroes on a worldly level. They are. But there's a reason why they're not saints. They gave up the faith for political gain in that context. And we've accepted that. That's in all of the testimonies. So in relation to the revolutionaries, I think we just have to create a bit of a taxonomy or a hierarchy of value that we ascribe to them. Yes, they are heroes. Yes, I respect them. I'll be the first to celebrate Locotrones and his peers as those who fought so that we can express the faith freely, build our churches, publicly worship, and this also had a role, and I think the church's role in this context was very important precisely because, in contrast to those other nations, the Western nations that underwent revolutions like France, they destroyed the Catholic Church when they did that, or the Russian Revolution, the church did have a role in the shaping of modern Greece's public life and sensibilities, and that's a good thing, but that is on a lower register, I believe, than the lives of the saints who imitate in the life of Christ, perfectly loving their neighbour unto death, so that they might live forever with him in his kingdom. Am I capable of doing that? No. I'll either pick up the gun or I'll run away. I'm not saying I'm one of them. I hope I don't do either of those things, but I have my weaknesses.
Vasili wants to reply to this. I can see that in his eye. Vasili, πες μας.
Δεν το καταλαμβάνει το κοινό. Δεν διαφωνώ με όσα είπε ο Μάριος. Δεν είναι καθόλου ίσα-ίσα. Απλά είναι ένα δύσκολο ερώτημα. Είναι πραγματικά πολύ δύσκολο το ερώτημα αυτό, διότι αν το δούμε από την οπτική του Ιησού, δεν έχουμε στην περίπτωση του Κυρίου καμία κατάφαση επανάστασης. Καμία.
Ούτε όταν λέει ήρθα να φέρω μάχαιρα.
Ούτε και όταν λέει αυτό το πράγμα. Ποτέ δεν έχουμε κατάφαση επανάστασης.
Ούτε όταν διώχνουν τους εμπόρους από τον ναό.
Έχει υπόψη του μια επανάσταση. Έχει υπόψη του μια επανάσταση Στη μικρά αποκάλυψη, που είναι η πτώση της Ιερουσαλήμ, μια πτώση η οποία εμπλέκει τους επαναστατημένους Εβραίους, ο Κύριος λέει ότι όταν το ακούσετε αυτό, πάρτε τα βουνά. Όχι πάρτε τα όπλα, πάρτε τα βουνά. Και αυτό για μας που σκεφτόμαστε με όρους 1821 είναι ακόμα πιο προκλητικό. Και γίνεται ακόμα πιο προκλητικό γιατί έχουμε έναν Ισαΐα Σαλώνων. Ισαΐα Σαλώνων, ο οποίος πέφτει στο πεδίο της μάχης. Έχουμε έναν Ιωσήφ Ρογών που ανατινάζεται και γίνεται κομμάτια, 1000 κομμάτια.
Επίσης, αν μιας το αναφέρεις, οφείλω να πω ότι η Επανάσταση δεν θα είχε γίνει ποτέ, the revolution would have never taken place without the support of Ignatius of Hungary and Vlachia, because he provided the money to buy the ammunition for this. Ο Ιγνάτιος Ουγγαροβλαχίας αγόρασε όλα τα όπλα για την Επανάσταση. Otherwise there wouldn't be no revolution if you have no weapons.
Όχι μόνο αγόρασε τα όπλα, αλλά δημιούργησε και τις γιάφκες, τα περίφημα ελληνομουσεία, σε όλη την κεντρική Ευρώπη, να πηγαίνουν τα παιδιά να σπουδάζουν.
Ναι.
Τι να σπουδάζουν? Τι να σπουδάζουν? Μάθουν γράμματα. Τι γράμματα? Γράμματα σπουδάματα. Γράμματα που τους προετοίμαζαν ουσιαστικά για να γίνουν η πρώτη έφλεκτη ύλη του Ιερού Λόγου. Αυτά τα παιδιά που σπούδαζαν στα ελληνομουσεία του Ιγνατίου, ο οποίος ήταν, να το πω λίγο έτσι, τάτσι μιτσικότσι, με τον Καποδίστρια, αυτοί οι σπουδαστές προετοιμάζονταν για τον Ιερό Λόγο. Τι σημαίνει για έναν δεσπότη, να σας το πω πιο απλά, τι σημαίνει για έναν δεσπότη ή για έναν παπά? Ότι παίρνει τα όπλα και σκοτώνει. Σύμφωνα με το κανονικό δίκαιο, έχει παίξει τη ζωή του, όχι τη ζωή του την πρόσκαιρη, την αιώνια ζωή του, την έχει παίξει κορώνα γράμματα. Αυτό είναι η χριστιανική αγάπη. Να παίξεις τη ζωή σου κορώνα γράμματα. Όχι να παλεύουν οι άλλοι να σκοτώνονται και εσύ να κάθεσαι από μια γωνιά και να τους ευλογάς, αλλά να μπαίνεις μπροστά. Αν είστε όλοι να χαθείτε, να καταδικαστείτε στην κόλαση, πάω πρώτος μαζί σας εγώ. Έτσι πιστεύεις σε έναν Θεό της ελευθερίας, σε έναν Θεό ο οποίος μπορεί και να αλλάξει γνώμη.
Father Gerasimos, you take the weapon and get out there,
Look, Vasilis' take on the question of clergymen taking up arms, look, I find very conflicting, and with all due respect, I say that. Look, it's a dilemma. We have a long history of even in the Byzantine period of pacifism in regards to the clergy. It is anti-canonical against the Church's canons for a clergyman to take up arms and kill in war. So it is certainly unacceptable. And even though in Byzantium or in the Eastern Christian Roman Empire, there are many wars where, priests prayed for the soldiers and prayed for the members of their community to come back safe and sound. That stands to reason in my way of looking at things. We have a very famous example, and I'm sure those of you who have been my students, I always refer to this as a stellar example of a antiphasis. And it was very interesting that you said, when did Jesus actually do a kataphasis, an actual affirmation of any rebellion? And he didn't. So the example I'd like to give is this, that in the same way that Muslims use jihad as a way of bringing in their soldiers to a complete fatalist sort of approach to warfare and having no fear at all, by declaring them martyrs, even though they were the attackers, but dying in war in the name of Islam and Allah, they become martyrs officially. We had the Emperor Nikephoros Phokas, who has just come back from Crete, having liberated Crete from the Muslims, thank you very much, in the 900s, after Crete being in Muslim hands for 300 years by that stage, saying, why don't we do the same? And he approaches the Patriarch of the time and he says, can we do the same? Can we declare those soldiers, Christian soldiers, who fought and died in battle against the Muslims as Christian martyrs? This was an emperor asking this of the church of the time. And the answer of the church was no. We cannot do that. They fought patriotically, they fought for freedom, they fought for liberating the Christians of Crete, but we cannot possibly declare them martyrs. A martyr is someone who is passively receiving violence in the name of their faith and not engaging in active violence. So this pacifist expression of essentially what Jesus teaches, which is when Apostle Peter pulls out his sword to defend Jesus, Jesus says, put the sword back in its sheath. That's the basic tenet of Christian pacifism. And there's a couple of other examples as well.
Can I be the Russians' advocate here?
Please.
The Russians don't believe, they are Orthodox, but they don't believe that. They have military saints, and very important military saints. Alexander Nevsky, the most important of all. Yeah.
We're aware of that. And of course, the whole historical question in this regard is, to what extent is this Christian? You know, and obviously we don't want to put anything in black and white categories. But Alexander Nevsky, which you might be referring to, the great military saint who fought against the Teutonic Knights, who were also engaged in holy warfare against the Russians, not against Muslims, against Orthodox Christians, he eventually abandons political power and he dies in ascesis. So we should see things a little bit more, not as black and white, but with a lot of grey. Not too much grey?
No.
Okay, all right.
Anyway.
That's okay. So,
αλλά οι Ρώσοι είναι πάντα περίεργοι, όπως ξέρετε εδώ πέρα.
Yeah, the Russians are in a class of their own when it comes to military history. But look, I don't want to carry on too much. Maybe we could give it to other panellists or a question.
I think there's a big white elephant in the room. St. Basil himself says that soldiers returning to war must refrain from Holy Communion for 3 years. This is not to say that the soldiers coming back are condemned as murderers. He's saying that war is harming the soul. Soldiering harms the soul. These are very important things we have to take in mind, particularly when we're talking about the Three Hierarchs here today.
That's a very good point, and I thank you, Sandy, for bringing that up. I forgot about that. But St. Basil himself provides a canon that says soldiers returning from warfare should take time out from communion, because we know what they have had to do. Necessary evil, no doubt, but that's the right balance, you see. We don't glorify war. And so the whole rebellion or revolution of 1821 raises this question. And the criticism, for example, that the Serbians received in the 90s, and I remember being in high school at that time, of, they've got the priests blessing the weapons. Well, that's a question we have to face. To what extent is this okay? Do we bless the people going into warfare for their safety / soteria, or are we blessing their weapons? I hope we weren't blessing their weapons.
But the weapons are used by some people, κατ' οικονομίαν. Μην ξεχνάς το κατ' οικονομίαν, έτσι. Δηλαδή αυτή η στεναχωρία του γένους. Remember what one of the most important elements of the Patriarch of Constantinople is that he declared that during the στεναχωρία του γένους, and it's very interesting that he doesn't use the word ethnos, but genos, which is a completely different notion in this case, was that κατ' οικονομία, these are allowed. We have so many heroes in Crete during the rebellions in the 19th century. Remember the famous Arkadi, he blew himself up. We have all these heroes then. Most of them didn't be, they are martyrs of the church, but not of the faith in this case. In this case. Of course, as you understand, Dimitri, can I ask you then what you think about that? With your experience, you have the macro historical view.
I don't have experience of being blown up, but
I wanted to say, there was very interesting comments that Vasily and Father Gerasimos brought up. I remember hearing a lecture by the current military chaplain, who's a priest in Greece. I was present at his lecture. And he was mentioning some very interesting details. One of them was that whereas priests fought, it was not only that he was putting his own life on line, but he was prepared to forego his priesthood should he eventually kill somebody. So it was a conscious decision that the priest made, he was saying, that if I'm to be forced into battle, I will take the consequences. I'll give up my priesthood. That's one thing. And you could judge it any way you like, but that was the reality that they were facing. Another thing, back to the historical national assemblies that were taking place during the revolution, there was an interesting stipulation that the military chaplains were established. So not necessarily priests who were there with a gun, but priests who were assigned, and it says 1 per 1,000 soldiers, 1 priest per 1,000 soldiers, to see to the needs of those soldiers, the needs that they had. And it even stipulates how many grossia they'd be paid per month. So that's an interesting dimension of clergy, revolution, war as well. It's not necessarily other priests going to be killing. There's so many other things.
Yeah, because the priests live in history as well. And they live in society. They are social beings. They are formed by the same impulses and the same forces that born of us as well. And they have to participate. Otherwise, if you remain outside the whole thing, right? It's like, for example, let's say the Roman Catholic Church during the Holocaust. Or this abstinence, I mean, recently, since yesterday, we had the day of the Holocaust commemoration. Remember, the only priest, one of the very few priests that fought against the Holocaust was the Archbishop of Athens. He declared at the moment that the Athenian Jews were actually rounded up to be sent to, I think, Birkenau, Auschwitz, he declared the church on persecution, and he started holding the bells. The bells throughout Athens. Να μην μιλήσουμε βέβαια για το Χρυσόστομο της Ζακίνθου, of Zakynthos, that he completely sort of saved all of them, and that's why they call Zakynthos the island of the righteous to this day. Things. So I think the one does not exclude the other. The things. With your experience, Mario, what do you think about this? I think, I thought they said absolutism in your voice. Detected that. So can we allow history to take over our existence?
I don't mean to give an either or.
There's no either or. Yes and no, and two.
I think things are very complicated. So if the highest standard for us as Christians is the self-sacrificial love of Christ who defeated death.
Yeah, but Christ is Christ. Us, we're humans.
The saints are Christ with a small c. That's the thing. So if that's the standard, then that's what we have to reach for. I don't say that this is against in any way the heroes of the revolution who had their own struggles, passions, concerns, weaknesses, difficulties. I'm not opposing the two. Please don't get me wrong. I think that there are two registers. The highest register is Christ and the saints. Then we have our heroes, whether it's Locotrones, Paleologo, or Leonidas. It doesn't matter who they are. They are on a different level, a lower level, still important. Nowhere near as important as Christ as the saints. I don't agree. I loved your presentation. I don't necessarily agree that it would benefit any of us if any of our priests or clergy gave up their priesthood. Why? Because of an anecdote that it haunts me, this one, from the letters of St. Barsanuphios and John, and I remember His Grace commenting on this last year. St. Barsanuphios wrote a letter which was delivered to the monks in Palestine, who said that the world is perishing. There is a great famine and we are all suffering. Please pray for us to the Lord so that He might lift this famine from us. St. Barsanuphios responded, there are 3 men who stand before the shattered world and pray for it, and also before the altar of Christ. One is in Rome, one is in Jerusalem. He didn't mention the third, but it was him. Because of their prayers, he says, the world has not suffered worse. Because of their prayers. Prayer is the most important thing. Prayer is the most important thing, especially prayer, not at the expense of the prayer of the laity, all of us, but especially the prayers of our appointed shepherds and priests, that entreat the master who is in charge of everything. And this is what we have to remember at the end of the day. Christ is present in all of these circumstances. He is not somehow a God outside of them. I think you might have implied that. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. He is both above all things, within all things, in between us, within us, those who are baptized in his name, and he allowed the revolution for our benefit. He did. I'd like to believe that, and I do believe that. But I think
that raises many questions, I have to tell you, at the moment.
But that
defies the haute exousion, the synergy model that exists in the Orthodox Church.
But there is synergy.
What is it if Christ is in everything? He cannot be in murder. So you exclude him from certain things. So we have to keep that down. I mean, this is a sort of a kind of a yes. All right. Εδώ.
Just few thoughts. I think that when, and I'm not saying that I know the truth, I'm just thinking, and I'm sharing the thoughts with you. When we have to deal with a war, I think that Old Testament rules kick in. But we have a recent example, which is Bishop Athanasios Yeftids. When there was the war in Serbia, he would put on Psalm 83, «Ως αγαπητά τα σκηνώματά σου, Κύριε των δυνάμεων». He would take the Holy Cup and he will go at the front line of the soldiers to give them Holy Communion. He didn't care if he would die or not. That's something I would, if I could, imitate, but I wouldn't sort of take a gun and go and kill the Turks, if it was me. But that's a personal thing. So everyone is different. But I guess sometimes God allows things to happen, and I think what Marios was trying to say is that the Holy Spirit controls the history, regardless of what we as humans do. But of course, we have the αυτεξούσιο, we have our own willpower, and we can use it one way or another. And even if we use it wrong, God can still make good things happen. Like we see, there is a bush full of thorns, and then there are roses coming up. So God can reverse things. But if it was for me to choose, I would choose what Bishop Athanasios did, Yeftids, and I wouldn't blow up myself, although this is something very heroic. And why I wouldn't do that? Because that's how I would express my faith, and that's how I would approach this matter. But God, who knows more, even if people treat things in a different way, he might still make good things happen. That's all.
Yep. Oh, Father. Yeah.
Yes.
Καθίστε, ναι. Θέλετε ερώτηση συγκεκριμένη?
Can I just make a comment and a question?
Exactly.
Okay. So my comment is, I think we need to realize that the Greek Revolution, like things happened that are not acceptable to the modern eye today. Okay? I think we have to realize that things happened that wouldn't really happen today. So you had deaths. You had cases where obviously clergymen took arms and killed other people. Obviously it was during the Greek Revolution. Things happened that sometimes were out of control. Okay, so I think we need to start avoiding the idealization of certain aspects of the Greek Revolution, and to realize that certain things happened that shouldn't have really happened. Especially if we talk about...
You mean atrocities?
Atrocities, if we talk about the treatment of Jews during the Greek Revolution.
And the Turks in Tripoli.
We have to be realists, we have to understand that things happened, atrocities happened that were not ideal, were not good, okay? My question is, was the product the final product of the Greek Revolution, the formation of the Greek state? Was that what the revolutionary leaders had in mind? For example, a few decades later, the Church of Greece was cut away from the ecumenical patriarchate.
Autocephalus,
yes.
Yeah.
And the church in Greece was considered schismatic for, 50, 60 years?
Όχι, 15 years.
Yes.
1853,
Yes.
ο τόμος, ο συνοδικός
Yes.
τόμος, και έγινε αποδεκτός.
Okay, so was that what the Greek state, is that what they had visualized when they were fighting the Greek Revolution?
Well, don't forget, since you mentioned that, the great Orthodox theologian Gianaras explained why the Orthodox Church was against the revolution, according to him. And he was against the revolution himself. He wrote a whole book that him, as an Orthodox theologian, would have never accepted the revolution, because essentially created a nation state, and we don't have nations in Christianity, we're all a genos, and then created an autocephalus church, which essentially started the dismantling of the patriarchate. Αλλά αυτό είναι μια θεωρία τώρα, είναι speculative way, because essentially history has happened. Gianaras wrote this in a whole book about that. Father, what do you think about that? Should we have the autocephalus church?
Before we go to that, I think what Father Athanasio, his question is very correct. Was the result what they envisaged?
No.
And this is a very good question, because you need to go back to the sources, and what you will discover is that some wanted this, the resurrection of the Byzantine Empire, some of them. Others didn't want that. Others wanted a liberal democracy / nation state as modelled by the very recent American Revolution and French Revolution. Rigas Fereos was imbued by all these ideas coming from the West. Koutsouras had different ideas of what was supposed to happen. One area where Koutsouras and at least the Patriarch Grigorios V were in agreement was that this was premature. Both of them said this is not the right time. We're not ready. We need more resources. We need more finances. This is all in the sources. And so we have to come to terms with these sources and try and understand that yes, the aftexousion, the whole question of what we do as free human beings is in an interplay with God's providence, and that things do get messy. The result was this: we got neither a democracy nor an empire. Correct? Correct? So we got a Western European monarchy imposed on us ultimately, which shut down half the monasteries of Greece, correct? This is the historical fact. And created great turmoil. The schism of the Greek church from Constantinople, is that what they wanted, the revolutionaries? I don't think so. Also, if you go back to the denouncement of the Patriarch Gregory V, if you read his denouncement of the revolution, even though he died because of it, if you read his denouncement, he was so wise. People who criticize Patriarch Grigorios for denouncing the revolution call him a traitor. But if you read his work, you will find that he had foresight. He said, if we start this, there will be massacres and endless destruction. And you can say all this, you bring this up to the Greeks of Asia Minor, you can say this to, because the bookend, Dimitri, let me correct you, the bookend was not 1821, the bookend was 1922. Because the whole idea of liberating Greece under those models of classical liberalism mixed together with the ancient Byzantine resurrection of the empire, what was the price? What was the price? Elimination, complete annihilation of the Greek genos in all parts except that liberal nation state. Everyone wiped out by the end of it. I'm talking about Asia Minor, the whole genocide. All these people, did they have to suffer this? So these are questions that we have to ask ourselves because they are difficult questions. We should not idealise, and I thank you, Father Athanasio, we should not idealise the revolution and paint it in some sort of whitewashed way, but deal with the historical truth and address it honestly.
Now, Father, with these words, which are very unsettling and very interesting and very inspiring, I'd like to invite Georgia, because we are gone over time, I think, and we have to bring the whole thing to a close. Well, thank you so much for this discussion. We could go on. Θα μπορούσαμε να συνεχίσουμε μέχρι αύριο, αλλά νομίζω ότι έχουμε ήδη εξαντλήσει το κοινό μας εδώ, έτσι. Και the interesting thing is that the different interpretations, perspective, approaches that we have to the event. That is to say, we are not a monophonic tradition. We're not totalizing the tradition, but we're trying to find diversity within the tradition itself, a plurality of interpretations and a plurality of ways of approaching this event. And I'm grateful to all of you, all four of you tonight, because we could go on forever, but we don't have the time. The forever lasts only one night, all right, as you know. Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to our panellists for those insightful reflections and explorations of theology and revolution, a very thought-provoking way to end the evening. I'd like to invite Dr. Panagiotis Diamandis, President of AHEA, to say a few words.
Before I actually do close everything, θα καλούσα πρώτο τον κύριο Γενικό Πρόξενο. Το κλείσει το κοινό. Εντάξει. Άστο τώρα. Τώρα που τα πλέξαμε. Thank you all, Dimitri especially, but Πατέρα Γεράσιμε, whenever I think of you, I always think of the moment we bumped into each other in the snow in Thessaloniki. I just heard this voice saying Panagiotis, and I look around and that was, what, 15 years ago? Probably longer. It was 20. Εντάξει. Maria, Vasili, Vrasidas φυσικά. The one thing that I take away from tonight, apart from the collaboration of, for the first time, of all these groups, πέρυσι κάναμε την πρώτη ομιλία για τους τρεις ιεράρχες εδώ, η Θεολογική Σχολή με το σύλλογό μας, και φέτος ήρθαν ένωσαν τις δυνάμεις τους και ο σύλλογος των φοιτητών. The one thing I take away is, and which we didn't really get to explore, is the role of clergy as educators in the revolution, not just beforehand. Not just educators in the classroom, but in terms of life. Ο Σκυλόσοφος. I've walked past the place of his martyrdom many times. It's in Yanina. The cave is still there, where he was actually skinned alive. I've been to a place called Kungi, στο Σούλι, where the monk blew up the monastery rather than surrendering. Exactly όπως και στο Αρκάδι που είπες. These were all teachers as well. They weren't just clergymen. They didn't just have a religious role. They also had a role as educators. And this is why we play such an important role in the celebrations of the entire year. And hopefully in the next week, 2 weeks, Vasili, what do you think, 2 weeks or so? The education part of the website of the Archdiocese National Committee will be up and running, so we can continue online to explore not only the interrelationship of orthodoxy and education, but also orthodoxy and education in an Australian context, which, Your Grace, we've spoken about this online, but never face-to-face. A big focus of the website will be precisely this. How does the War of Independence interact with Australia? Most of you would probably say, yeah, okay, it really doesn't. You'd be surprised just how it does. You'd be surprised by the poems that were written by Australians, not Orthodox. Poems published in the Australian newspapers για την εθνική παλιγεννησία, about our war of independence, by people who had never been to Greece, probably never met a Greek. Think about it, 1820s, the Greek population of Australia was about 7, maybe 8. How does this connect? This will be a panel and a discussion for another time, but keep an eye on the Facebook of the National Committee, which will have the links to the education part of the website, especially if you're educators or you're going to be, a number of your members would be education students. Keep an eye on it, use the resources, take a look at them, give us your feedback, tell us what you think of them, how we can improve it, because the idea of this is that on the 31st of December 2021, the celebrations end, and we move on to next year's anniversary, a very dark one, of course, the Holocaust of Smyrna. And I use that word on purpose, because a very interesting Englishman, I think he was a drunk, but a very interesting Englishman called Winston Churchill called it a Holocaust. What happened at Smyrna in September of 22, he called it a Holocaust. An administrative one. But that's my specialty in genocide, and believe me, the War of Independence had a number of genocides, and I could go on for ages, but I'm not. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to the Theological College, of course to His Eminence, Your Graces, for blessing the event. The SOFIA, Sydney Uni, it's just Sydney Uni? All the universities, καλύτερα. Orthodox Fellowships. I hope we can make this an annual event, actually. I hope we can make this Three collaboration an annual event. In many ways, the Educators Association is the final stage of education, which is actually being the next generation of educators. So we start with the students under the guidance, spiritual guidance, and practical guidance, and become educators. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your support. And I have an idea I want to talk about later with the panel about what we do beyond this. But thank you once again to everyone.
Your Graces, Very Reverend Fathers, Professor, Doctors, distinguished guests, my brief speech may have become a bit untimely after this very interesting discussion, but anyway, I'll go ahead with it. It's brief anyway. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here today with you to commemorate together the feast of the Three Hierarchs, patron saints of all Orthodox students and educators. Today we had the opportunity to reflect on their crucial role in shaping Christian theology, on Greek Revolution, on their contribution to creating a constructive dialogue between ancient Greek philosophy and the Christian faith, and on their enormous contribution to education. The Feast of the Three Hierarchs, which here in Australia coincides with the opening of the new academic year, provides a fitting opportunity for all of us to acknowledge the paramount importance of education in our life as individuals and collectively as societies. Education plays indeed a fundamental role both in enhancing the lives of the individual and in allowing a society to develop and flourish. Education can offer a strong sense of identity, belonging, and self-worth. Education can instill values that inspire students to make a positive contribution to the wider community. By honoring the Feast of the Three Hierarchs, we pay tribute not only to these ecumenical teachers, but also to all educators who strive to instill values and ideals into their students. With these few thoughts, I would like to congratulate St. Andrew's Greek Orthodox Theological College, SOFIA Orthodox Student Association, and the Australian Hellenic Educators Association on holding this event. And I would like to wish you all a very happy, healthy, and fulfilling academic year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of St. Andrew's Greek Orthodox Theological College, SOFIA Orthodox Student Association, and the Australian Hellenic Educators Association, I would like to thank our speakers and everyone for their attendance tonight. I hope everyone enjoyed this evening in honour of the Three Hierarchs. I would now like to invite His Grace Bishop Elpidios to conclude the evening with prayer. And following this, everyone is welcome to help themselves to some refreshments at the back of the hall.
Όλοι μαζί. Διευχών των Αγίων Πατέρων και Μητέρων ημών, Κύριε Ιησού Χριστέ ο Θεός ημών, ελέησον και σώσον ημάς. Αμήν.